Welcome back to the deep dive. If you're listening to this, you are probably someone who likes to, peel back the layers of the news cycle. You
Hmm.
see the headlines, the wars, the protests, the chaos on campus, and you start to wonder, is this all just random noise? Is the world just catching fire in a dozen different places at once?
Right.
Or is there a pattern? Is there some kind of script?
I think that's the ultimate question for anyone paying attention right now. I mean, we are seeing so much instability from the Middle East to the streets of, well, London and New York.
Everywhere.
And it's so easy to compartmentalize it all. You put the war in Gaza in one box. You put the culture wars about, say, gender or history in another box. You put the migration crisis in a third.
Exactly. We tend to think of these as separate fires. But today we're looking at a source that just takes a sledgehammer to those walls. We're doing a deep dive into a speech that argues, no, these are not separate fires. This is one single conflagration. It's one war fought on multiple fronts with one single objective.
And that objective, according to our source for today, is nothing less than the destruction of Western civilization.
It is a heavy, heavy topic, but we're going to unpack it with a very specific guide today. We're looking at a speech delivered by Melanie Phillips. Now, for those who might not know her, how would you even describe her?
Melanie Phillips she's distinct. She's a British journalist and author, and she has a reputation for being a bit of a firebrand.
A bit. Yeah.
She actually started her career on the political left, writing for The Guardian, which is, the bastion of British progressivism.
Yeah.
But over the decades, she shifted sharply.
Right.
She became one of the most vocal critics of multiculturalism, of the left, and of Islamism. She wrote a book called Londonistan, which was just a massive bestseller.
So she is not someone who holds back.
Never. She speaks with this very specific kind of moral urgency. And this speech we're analyzing today, it's titled The Unholy Alliance, Why the Left Loves Jihad, was delivered at MCC Brussels. And this wasn't a casual chat. She addresses the room as people who are fighting the good fight.
So she sees herself and her audience as combatants in a way.
Absolutely. 100%.
Yeah.
She sees this as a manifesto for survival.
Okay, let's get into the meat of it. I want to start with the hook she uses because it really, really sets the stakes. She opens with this incredibly stark proposition. She says, and I'm quoting here, "A war against Europe and the West is underway to conquer it for Islam. A war against the Jewish world is underway to exterminate it. These two things are umbilically connected."
Umbilically connected, that phrase.
It's such a visceral image, isn't it?
It is. It's biological. It implies a lifeline. Like you cut the cord, both entities die. Or they share the same blood supply. This is the core thesis we're going to explore today.
Yeah.
This idea that the war against the Jews and the war against the West are not two different things.
They're the same war.
They're the same war.
And most people just do not see it that way.
No, they don't. Most Westerners, I think, even those who are sympathetic to Israel, view the conflict in the Middle East as, well, a Middle Eastern problem.
It's over there.
It's over there. It's complicated. It's about land or, borders or some ancient religious feud. What Phillips is doing is grabbing the listener by the lapels and saying, you are wrong. This is not a foreign policy issue. This is a domestic survival issue.
She frames it as a crisis of survival for the West.
Exactly. And she sets up this paradox immediately. She talks about how the West views Israel. If you listen to, say, the UN or the Biden administration or the EU, the general vibe is often that Israel is a problem to be managed.
It's irritant.
It's an irritant. If Israel would just stop fighting, if Israel would just agree to a ceasefire, then, everything would calm down.
She calls this the solution paradox.
She does. And she flips that completely on its head. She argues that Israel isn't the problem. Israel is the solution. She believes that the Jews are the front line of the West's own defense.
It's sort of like the canary in the coal mine concept, but more aggressive.
Oh, much more aggressive. A canary just, dies to warn you.
Yeah.
Phillips is arguing that Israel is more like the immune system of the West.
That's a good analogy.
And if the West suppresses its own immune system because it finds the fever annoying, the West will die of the infection.
She points to a very specific date as the catalyst for this entire discussion, October 7th, 2023.
The starting gun, that's what she calls it.
She describes the attacks on October 7th not just as a tragedy or as a terror attack, but as a test, a civilization-level test. The challenge that was thrown down by Hamas was essentially, will you support civilization or will you support barbarism?
And this is where her assessment gets really, really dark. She looks at the response to October 7th, and she concludes, The West failed.
How so? Because, I mean, we did see condemnation. We saw leaders fly to Israel.
We did, initially,
Yeah.
for a moment. But Phillips asks us to look closer at the timeline and, I guess, the depth of that support. She points out that this was the single biggest slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust. The brutality was medieval burning families alive, sexual violence on a scale that's hard to comprehend, kidnapping babies. In her view, a healthy civilization, a civilized world, would have reacted with absolute, unwavering support for the victim.
But that's not what happened.
No, not at all. Instead, the narrative shifted almost immediately. The civilized world, as she puts it, turned on the victim. She describes the conflict that followed not as a simple war of defense, but as a seven-front war.
Right.
You have Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, militias in Syria and Iraq, and all of it, she says, is orchestrated by Iran.
And she is very, very specific about the goal of that war.
Yes. She says it's not about borders. It's not about a two-state solution. It is explicitly genocidal. She quotes the Islamist leadership directly. They aren't hiding their intentions. They say, first the Saturday people, then the Sunday people.
First the Jews, then the Christians.
Exactly. So if you are a Westerner sitting in Paris or London or New York, and you're thinking, this doesn't concern me, Phillips is saying, you are on the list. You just happen to be further down the list.
And she argues that the West is completely delusional for thinking they can just throw Israel under the bus to save themselves.
It's the old Churchill line, right? About feeding the crocodile hoping it eats you last. Phillips argues that by abandoning Israel, the West is signaling its own weakness. It's signaling that it doesn't have the stomach to fight for its own values.
This brings us to the second big section of our dive, which is what she calls the inversion of reality.
This is a fascinating psychological analysis she does here.
She uses the phrase through the looking glass, like Alice in Wonderland. Everything is completely backward.
Up is down, victim is aggressor, truth is lie.
She points to the reaction on the streets. And this was a detail that really stuck with me. She talks about the timeline of the protests. I remember seeing those massive marches, tens of thousands of people in London, flags waving everywhere. And the narrative was, these are anti-war protests. These are pro-Palestinian humanitarian marches.
Right. Stop the bombing. Ceasefire now.
But Phillips points out, and the timeline absolutely supports this, that these demonstrations began while the attacks were still happening. Or, immediately after, while the bodies were still being collected, but before Israel had launched any major ground offensive.
That is her smoking gun for the inversion. If you are marching to stop the war before the war has actually started, what are you actually marching for?
Right.
If you are marching while Jewish women are being held hostage and tortured, and you aren't mentioning them,
Right.
what are you celebrating?
She calls it a delirious assertion of Islamic power over Western streets.
That is a terrifying phrase.
Yeah.
A delirious assertion. She views those protests not as a plea for human rights, but as a victory lap. She sees it as the Islamists and their allies planting a flag in the heart of the West and saying, we are here and we have the numbers.
And this feeds directly into the inversion of the term genocide.
The crime of crimes.
Phillips is incredibly scornful of the accusation that Israel is committing genocide. She calls it a blood libel, a modern blood libel.
She points out just the logistical absurdity of it. She calls it the first genocide in history, where the aggressor is actively supplying food, water, and fuel to the victims.
Yeah.
She talks about the warnings, the flyers, the phone calls, the text messages, the corridors for evacuation. She asks, if Israel wanted to commit genocide, why are they warning people to get out of the way?
It's a strong point. I mean, actual genocides, Rwanda, the Holocaust, they don't typically involve humanitarian aid corridors.
No, they involve rounding people up, not telling them to move south to a designated safe zone.
But then, of course, there are the casualty numbers. We hear them every single day. 30,000 dead, 40,000 dead. And Phillips attacks these numbers. She says we're just uncritically relying on Hamas-provided numbers.
And here is where she uses sort of pure logic to deconstruct the narrative. She notes that in all these reports coming from the Gaza Health Ministry, which is run by Hamas.
Right, which is a key detail.
A crucial detail. There's a statistical anomaly. They list thousands of women, thousands of children, thousands of elderly, but they list almost zero combatants.
It's like the soldiers just don't exist in the death toll.
She says it suggests that Gaza is the first society in human history to have abolished natural death and military death. If you're fighting an intense urban war against a heavily armed, dug-in enemy, and you're telling me that 100% of the casualties are civilians, that is, It's statistically impossible.
So it implies that Israel is either the most incompetent military in the world or the numbers are being manipulated.
Exactly. But the looking glass effect means that the Western media and even governments accept the terrorist organization's numbers as fact, and they treat the democratic nation's statements with extreme suspicion. It's totally backwards.
She also talks about how language itself is being redefined to support this inversion. Zionism is the big one.
This is so crucial for understanding the current climate on campuses and, in activist circles. Zionism, historically and by definition, is simply the movement for the self-determination of the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland. It's a liberation movement. It's about having a safe haven after 2,000 years of persecution.
But that's not how it's used on campus these days.
No. Phillips argues it has been successfully rebranded as Nazism or racism or colonialism.
Which is just a heavy, heavy irony given that Zionism was the response to Nazism.
It is the ultimate inversion. But it serves a strategic purpose. If you rebrand Zionist as Nazi, then you make Zionists, which, by the way, includes the vast majority of Jews, into valid targets.
Right.
You strip them of moral protection. You can then say, oh, I'm not anti-Semitic, I just hate Zionists. But if Zionist means most Jews, then you've just found a convenient loophole to practice Jew hatred in public while calling yourself an anti-racist.
It's a moral license to hate.
Precisely. It weaponizes the West's own core values, anti-racism, tolerance, all of it, against the Jews.
This leads us directly to the title of the speech, the Unholy Alliance. This is her third major section.
The so-called red-green alliance.
Red for the Marxist socialist left, green for Islam.
On paper, this is the strangest marriage in all of history.
It really is. I mean, let's just look at the values for a second. The progressive left champions LGBTQ rights, they champion radical feminism, they are overwhelmingly secular, often actively anti-religious, they support abortion rights.
Oh, true.
And then you have the Islamist faction, which, generally speaking, opposes all of those things, often violently.
Wow.
In a state run on Sharia law, the entire progressive platform is illegal.
It's a death sentence for a lot of it.
So how does Phillips explain this team up? Why are you seeing signs that say, queers for Palestine, at rallies alongside people who would, theoretically, throw them off a building in Gaza or Iran?
She argues it's a shared hatred. It's the old proverb, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and the shared enemy is the West.
So they both want to tear down the current structure.
Exactly. The left sees the West as a system of colonial oppression, white supremacy, and capitalism that needs to be dismantled. The Islamists see it as a system of infidel corruption and godlessness that needs to be conquered.
So they both want to burn the house down.
They both want to burn the house down. They might disagree on what to build on the ashes, but for now they agree on the arson.
She calls it a deranged obsession.
She does. But she points out that this didn't happen by accident. It wasn't just some spontaneous meeting of minds. She argues that this is the result of decades of what she calls idea laundering.
I love that term, idea laundering. It's like money laundering.
Yeah. It's a perfect metaphor, isn't it? You take a dirty idea like Israel has no right to exist or Jews are evil colonizers. If you just say that on a street corner, you sound like a bigot.
So you get to clean it up.
You run it through the washing machine of the universities. You create departments of post-colonial studies or settler colonial theory. You write academic papers. You use big words like intersectionality and hegemonic power structures. And suddenly, that dirty anti-Semitic idea comes out looking clean.
It looks scholarly.
It has footnotes.
And then it moves from the universities to the NGOs.
Right. And she goes hard on the human rights establishment. She lists the UN, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. She accuses them of laundering Hamas propaganda through lawfare.
Lawfare, that's another one of her key terms.
It's using the apparatus of the law as a puppet of war. She argues that these powerful international institutions have been captured by this ideology. They use international courts and UN resolutions to tie the hands of the democracy, which is Israel, while giving a free pass to the terror groups.
So it creates a scenario where the democracy is fighting with one hand tied behind its back and the other hand is holding a lawyer's brief.
And Phillips argues this isn't just about Israel. It's about destroying the concept of national sovereignty itself. If the UN can dictate to a sovereign nation how it defends its citizens from attack, then sovereignty is dead.
She even criticizes Western governments, the UK, France, the US. She says they are parroting lies.
She points out the bitter, bitter irony here. Europe, which she calls the graveyard of the Jewish people, is once again circulating blood libels about Jews killing children.
Wow.
She argues that by demanding Israel stop fighting, Western leaders are essentially demanding that Israel commit suicide. And by doing so, they are signaling to the Islamist that the West is weak, it's decadent, and it's easily manipulated.
So we have the what, the alliance, we have the how, the idea laundering. Now we need to get to the why. Why is the West doing this to itself? This is section 4, the cultural suicide.
And this is really the philosophical heart of her argument. This is where she stops talking about day-to-day politics and starts talking about the soul of the civilization.
She argues the West is in a decades-long process of cultural suicide.
It's a slow-motion collapse.
Yeah.
And she identifies the root cause as the abandonment of Judeo-Christian values. She calls this the moral scaffolding of our culture.
Let's unpack that image. Moral scaffolding. What does she mean by that?
Well, think of a great cathedral being built. It needs scaffolding to be constructed, and it needs an internal structure to hold it up. Phillips argues that Western civilization concepts like human rights, the dignity of the individual, equality before the law, even our sense of linear time and progress, they didn't just appear out of thin air.
Right.
They grew out of a very specific root, the Hebrew Bible.
And Christianity, which grew from that.
Right, the Judeo-Christian tradition. She argues that this tradition provided the conscience of the West. It gave us the fundamental distinction between right and wrong, good and evil.
But, we've moved past that. We're a secular society now.
And that is the problem, according to her. She says we didn't just remove the religion, we removed the entire concept of objective truth.
This is the shift to my truth versus your truth.
Exactly. We replaced truth with opinion and feeling. And this is a catastrophic shift in epistemology and how we know what is real.
Because if there is no objective truth,
then there are no lies. There are only competing narratives. And if there are only narratives, how do you decide who wins? You can't appeal to God. You can't appeal to a universal moral law. So what's left? You appeal to power.
The power dynamics framework.
This is the oppressor versus oppressed matrix. Phillips argues that this has completely replaced morality in the Western mind. In this worldview, everything is determined by your group's relationship to power. If you are weak or poor or from a non-Western background, you are the oppressed, and therefore you are virtuous. Your actions are always justified.
And if you're strong or successful or white,
then you are the oppressor, and therefore you are evil. Your success is not proof of merit, it's proof of your crime.
And this is where the Jews get stuck in this system.
They break the machine. This is a really key insight of hers. Historically, Jews are the ultimate victims. Persecuted, exiled, massacred, gassed. They should be at the very top of the victim hierarchy.
But they're not.
No. Because in the 21st century, Jews are perceived as white. They are perceived as successful. They have a state. They have a military that, wins wars. They have a thriving tech sector and Nobel Prizes.
So under the oppressor-oppressed logic,
They must be oppressors. And this leads to a complete moral short circuit in the progressive brain. In the social justice worldview, an oppressor cannot be a victim. It's structurally impossible. So when Israelis were slaughtered, raped, and burned alive on October 7th, the progressive left literally couldn't process it as a tragedy.
because they weren't seeing people.
They weren't seeing people. They looked at a dead Jew and saw a dead colonizer.
That explains the silence. It explains the coldness from so many quarters.
It explains why feminist groups didn't condemn the mass rape of Israeli women. Because in their ideology, those women belong to the oppressor class. And violence against an oppressor is just called resistance.
It's just chilling. It completely dehumanizes people based on a political category.
And Phillips argues this leads to a bigger philosophical error. Universalism versus particularism. It's a little bit intense, but it's really important to our argument.
Yeah, break this down for us.
So, after World War II, the West came to a conclusion. Nationalism is bad. Nationalism gave us Hitler. So we swung hard in the other direction towards universalism.
Imagine all the people.
Exactly. John Lennon. We are all just humans.
Yeah.
Borders are bad. Nation states are bad. We are all citizens of the world.
Which sounds nice. I mean, it sounds utopian.
It does sound utopian, but Phillips says it's a suicide pact. Because Western values, the things we actually like freedom of speech and tolerance and individual rights, are not universal. They are particular. They are the specific fruits of a very specific culture, Western biblical culture.
So if you throw away the roots, the nation, the Bible, the history, in an attempt to be universal, you end up losing the fruits.
Exactly. You unilaterally disarm your own culture. You assume everyone in the world wants what you want. You assume everyone else wants democracy and peace and human rights.
And when you meet a group like Hamas who explicitly says, We love death more than you love life.
The universalists cannot compute it. They can't understand it. They say, oh, they must be desperate. It must be because of poverty. They project their own values onto the enemy. They refuse to believe the enemy is actually an enemy.
This brings us to Section 5, the Trojan horse.
This is where she ties the culture war directly to the actual war. She calls the Palestinian cause the Trojan horse.
She says it has become a badge of conscience for the left.
Right. You wear the keffiyeh, you chant the slogans, and you feel virtuous. You feel like you're on the right side of history. But she says, look at the maps. Look at the symbols. The map on the protest placard isn't a map of the West Bank and Gaza.
It's the whole of Israel.
It's the whole of Israel, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea.
From the river to the sea.
Which is a call for the erasure of the state of Israel.
Yes.
So the badge of conscience is actually a call for the destruction of a nation.
And she breaks the Trojan horse down into 2 layers. It's like one of those Russian nesting dolls.
It is. Layer 1. Palestinianism is the Trojan horse for anti-Semitism.
Okay, how so?
She argues that under the guise of supporting Palestine, activists are bringing back ancient medieval hatreds. Blood libels, the idea that Jews kill babies to use their blood. Conspiracy theories, that Jews control the world, control the banks, control the media.
But they call it anti-Zionism.
Right. That's the disguise. That's the beautiful wooden horse.
Yeah.
But inside the horse is just classic old-fashioned Jew hatred.
And layer 2, what's inside that?
Anti-Semitism is the Trojan horse for the attack on Western civilization.
So if you destroy the Jews, you destroy the moral core of the West. Is that the idea?
That's exactly the idea. She believes that Jews are the guardians of those core Western values we talked about: justice, law, memory, the sanctity of life. If you wipe them out or if you delegitimize them, you pull the keystone out of the arch. The whole Western structure collapses.
She uses some very graphic language here regarding dehumanization. She talks about the imagery used against Jews. You know, rats, snakes, octopuses with their tentacles around the globe.
It's Nazi imagery. It's straight out of Der Stürmer. And her conclusion on this is absolutely devastating. She says that a society that tolerates this, that marches alongside people holding these signs, that allows this on its campuses, has become degenerate.
She says, and this is a direct quote, "A society of degenerate, dehumanizing barbarians will not survive and doesn't deserve to do so."
She is acting as an Old Testament prophet here. She is judging her own civilization and finding it wanting. She's saying, you have lost your soul, and because you've lost your soul, you are going to lose your life.
But she doesn't end on total despair. She does offer a way out. This is her final section. The solution.
Choosing life.
She lays out a manifesto. And it is not a soft, middle-of-the-road manifesto. It is hard line.
It is. She says, what is to be done? Plenty.
Let's run through her list. First, speak out.
This sounds simple, but she argues it's the hardest one. She says people need to refuse to accept the lies. She believes the silent majority is silent because they are terrified. They are afraid of being called racist, Islamophobe, bigot.
The social cost of speaking up is incredibly high right now.
It is. But Phillips argues that if you don't pay that cost now in social currency, you will pay a much, much higher cost later. You have to reassert Western values without apology.
Second on her list, education.
She wants to retake the universities. She calls them engines for the destruction of reason, and she wants them to go back to being crucibles of reason.
That implies a massive, massive overhaul.
Oh, it implies firing people. It
Yeah.
implies defunding entire departments. She doesn't get into the logistical weeds, but the intent is clear. Stop funding the institutions that are teaching your children to hate their own civilization.
Third, family.
She's a huge proponent of the traditional married family. She sees the breakdown of the family unit as a core part of the cultural suicide. If you don't have strong families, you don't pass on values to the next generation. You just create a vacuum.
And then we get to the really controversial geopolitical points, borders and sovereignty.
This is where she completely separates herself from the liberal consensus. She calls for curbing immigration. She calls for deporting Islamic extremists, and not just convicted terrorists, but those who preach hatred of the West.
And she specifically mentions banning Sharia law.
Yes. And we should explain why she says that. It's not just, I don't like this other religion. Her argument is a constitutional one. She says Sharia is fundamentally incompatible with liberal democracy because it claims to be a superior authority to the state.
You can't have two competing legal systems in one country.
Right. If one law comes from Parliament and another law comes from God, and those two laws conflict, the person following God's law cannot be a loyal citizen of the democratic state. Phillips argues you cannot have a state within a state.
And she wants to reclaim the whole concept of the nation-state.
For decades, we've been taught that nation-state leads to fascism. Phillips says, no, the Western nation-state is the only thing that prevents tyranny. You need borders to have laws. You need a collective we to have a democracy. If everyone is just a global citizen with no particular loyalties, there is no community to protect.
And finally, she points to a model, an example the West must follow. And it is the very country the West is currently condemning.
Israel.
Why Israel? What's the model there?
Because, in her view, Israel is the only Western nation that hasn't forgotten how to stay alive.
What does Israel have that the rest of the West lacks?
Identity. She says Israel understands and values what it is. It knows its history, it knows its biblical roots, it knows its enemies are real and they mean what they say. It hasn't been seduced by that universalist fog that makes you blind to threats.
It knows that if it stops fighting, it dies.
Exactly. She says the West, by contrast, despises itself. It teaches its children that their history is shameful, a long list of crimes. Israel teaches its children that their history is a miracle. And a culture that values itself will fight to survive. A culture that despises itself will eventually surrender.
Her final lesson is, in order to survive, a culture has to choose life.
It's the quote from Deuteronomy, from the Old Testament. I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life.
It brings the whole speech full circle. She starts with the political, the war, the left, the Islamists, and she ends with the theological, the existential.
She's telling the West, you are currently choosing death. You are choosing comfort over truth. You are choosing appeasement over defense. You need to look at Israel not as a problem to be solved, but as a teacher. You need to learn how to choose life again.
It is a powerful, deeply provocative thesis, and we have covered a massive amount of ground here. We've looked at the two wars, one struggle, the inversion of reality, the strange alliance between the left and Islam, and this whole concept of cultural suicide.
It's a lot to process.
Yeah.
And look, you don't have to agree with every single point she makes to see the value in the argument. It forces you to connect dots that you might not have connected before.
It challenges that compartmentalization we talked about right at the beginning.
Exactly. It forces you to ask, is the anti-Semitism I'm seeing on the news just a glitch? A bug in the system? Or is it a symptom of a much deeper rot in my own society?
And it raises the so what question for our listener. Why does this matter if you're just a regular person trying to, pay your mortgage and get by?
It matters because if she is right, even partially right, your world is much more fragile than you think. It matters because it asks you to examine your own values. What do you actually believe in? And are those beliefs strong enough to stand up against a serious challenge? Or are they just, that moral scaffolding that has already been kicked away?
That leads me to a final thought I want to leave with the listeners, a question for you to chew on.
Go for it.
Phillips argues that the West is collapsing because we discarded our religious scaffolding, that Judeo-Christian foundation. We replaced it with secularism, human rights, and, feelings. But her speech implies that those replacements are failing. They aren't strong enough to hold up the roof under pressure.
Right. They're cracking.
So the question is, what, if anything, has actually replaced that scaffolding? Can a civilization actually survive on a foundation of subjective feelings alone? Or do we need something transcendent, something bigger than ourselves, bigger than our politics, to keep the walls from falling down?
That is the ultimate question. The philosopher Nietzsche warned us about this a century ago.
Yeah.
If you kill the old gods, you create a vacuum, and vacuums always get filled, usually by monsters.
Something to think about as you watch the news tonight.
Indeed.
Thanks for diving deep with us. We know this was a heavy one, but we think it's an important one to grapple with.
Absolutely. Thanks for listening.
Stay curious, stay critical, and we'll see you in the next deep dive.